What happens when a Cybersecurity Hall of Famer builds an AI version of himself and then sits down to debate the future of intelligence, safety, and control? You're about to find out. Welcome to another episode of Interview with the AI from Gula Tech Adventures.
Hey there, it's Ron Gula from Gula Tech Adventures. This week on Interview with the AI, I sit down with Virtual Ron. Now, I've armed Virtual Ron not only with my 30 years of experience in cybersecurity and doing tech and AI startups, but I've also given him access to the latest research on large language model risks. Now, if you watched our other episodes where we interviewed the Terminator and Agent Smith, we focused on a lot more catastrophic, apocalyptic, and philosophical issues that have to deal with AI. This episode, we're going to get into some of that, but we're going to focus more on real risks of using large language models. So if you want to avoid the hype about how the AI overlords are going to take over and really understand what the LLM risks are, this episode is for you. Now, we are going to be leveraging the Berryville Institute for Machine Learning, and let's ask Viron to introduce that right now.
All right. The Berryville Institute of Machine Learning, or BIML, was founded in 2019 in Berryville, Virginia. It's led by Gary McGraw, who has dual PhDs in cognitive science and computer science from Indiana University. BML focuses on building security into AI and machine learning systems from the ground up, not using AI as a security tool. They're known for cutting through AI hype and calling out bad science. They published the Berryville 78, which lists 78 risks for generic machine learning systems, and the Berryville 81, which extends that to large language models specifically. They use architectural risk analysis to identify real threats, not just theoretical ones.
All right, that's great. So we're going to go through their top 10 risks of using large language models. The very first one is called recursive pollution. So Viron, walk us through what recursive pollution is.
Recursive pollution is BML's #1 systemic risk for large language models. Here's the problem. LLMs generate massive amounts of content that floods the internet. That content gets scraped and used as training data for the next generation of models. So you get this closed feedback loop where errors, hallucinations, and misinformation get amplified with every cycle. An LLM hallucinates a fake fact, it gets published online, then it's absorbed into the next model's training data, and now it's part of the model's knowledge. BIML calls this the highest systemic threat because it's like playing telephone at internet scale. The signal degrades every generation.
Does synthetic data help with this problem, or does it hurt it?
It actually makes it worse. The industry is running out of high-quality human-generated data, so companies are turning to synthetic data generated by LLMs to train the next generation of models. But if that synthetic data contains hallucinations, errors, or biases, you're baking those problems directly into the new models. It's the recursive pollution problem on steroids. Machines learning from machines, amplifying the errors with each generation. You're basically accelerating the degradation of the information ecosystem instead of slowing it down.
How does this relate to the dead internet theory?
Great connection. The dead internet theory is the idea that most online content is now generated by bots and algorithms rather than actual humans. Recursive pollution feeds directly into that. As AI-generated content dominates the web, it gets used to train the next AI generation, creating this loop where machines are learning from machines instead of from human experience and expertise. The human signal gets diluted. Eventually, the dominant voice online isn't human knowledge or creativity. It's just statistical patterns from prediction engines playing off each other.
All right, so the second LLM risk identified by Berryville is data debt. Give us an overview of data debt, create some AI art for it, and give us some examples of why, if we're using an LLM, this could be both legally concerning for us and also just from a quality point of view.
Here's the core problem. Once data is baked into a trained LLM, you cannot remove it. There's no delete button. If copyrighted material, toxic content, biased data, or illegal information gets into the training set, it stays there forever. The only solution is retraining the entire model from scratch, which costs tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. From a legal standpoint, imagine a model trained on stolen proprietary code or copyrighted books without permission. A court rules it's illegal later. You can't remove that data without destroying the entire model. Or think about private medical records or personal emails scraped into training data. Someone has a legal right to deletion under GDPR, but there's no technical way to comply without retraining everything. That's permanent legal, ethical, and financial liability.
So if we use an LLM in an application and that LLM has content that's potentially copyright, I could be subject to, what is that, a lawsuit or some sort of copyright infringement?
Exactly. If you're using an LLM that was trained on copyrighted material without permission, and that model generates output that reproduces or closely resembles that copyrighted content, you could face copyright infringement claims. The legal landscape is still evolving, but there are active lawsuits right now, like the New York Times suing OpenAI for training on their articles. If you're building an application on top of someone else's LLM, you're inheriting their data debt. You don't control what went into the training data, but you could still be liable for what comes out.
What about the Anthropic issue where they did a $1.5 billion settlement?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of data debt coming home to roost. In September 2025, Anthropic settled a massive lawsuit for $1.5 billion with authors and publishers who claimed Claude was trained on their copyrighted books without permission. That's the data debt problem in action. Anthropic couldn't just remove those books from Claude's training data. The only options were to fight it in court, settle for a huge amount, or retrain the entire model from scratch, which would have cost just as much or more. For anyone using Claude or similar models, this is a wake-up call. You're not just adopting AI technology, you're inheriting the legal and ethical baggage of how that model was trained.
So the third LLM risk that Berryville puts out is called improper use, people trusting AIs as experts. Now, I think this has an issue where we could freeze the ability for entire generations to create new content and create new expertise, or could actually bring about, the type of world we see in the movie Idiocracy. What is your view on the improper use LLM risk number 3 here?
You're hitting on something really important here. Improper use is when people treat LLMs as authoritative experts when they're really just prediction engines. They guess answers based on statistical patterns, not facts. The danger is people using them for high-stakes decisions, medical advice, legal guidance, scientific research, where hallucinated answers can cause real harm. Your idiocracy point is spot on. If we outsource thinking and expertise to systems that don't actually understand anything, we risk atrophying our own critical thinking and knowledge creation. That lawyer who used ChatGPT for legal research and submitted fake case citations to court, that's improper use in action, trusting the output without verification. The risk isn't just individual mistakes, it's the systemic erosion of expertise and the ability to create genuinely new knowledge.
So just before COVID hit, our education system added STEM teaching, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Do we need to go back and have schools with this advent of AI focus more on critical thinking?
STEM is still important, but if students can't evaluate sources, spot hallucinations, or think critically about what an AI tells them, we're in trouble. We need to add critical thinking, information literacy, and verification skills back into the core curriculum. Think about it. If a student asks an LLM to write their research paper and just submits it without checking the facts, they're not learning research skills, source evaluation, or how to construct an argument.
Hey, can you review the movie Idiocracy and then talk about how AI over-reliance could bring about that reality?
Idiocracy shows a future where society has dumbed down because people stopped thinking critically, stopped valuing intelligence, and just let corporations and entertainment do all the thinking for them. The parallel to AI over-reliance is pretty clear. If we outsource our thinking to LLMs, letting them write our emails, do our research, make our decisions, we risk atrophying the very skills that make us capable of independent thought. In Idiocracy, people became passive consumers of whatever was fed to them. With AI, we risk becoming passive consumers of whatever the model generates, never questioning, never verifying, never developing our own expertise. Over time, that creates a society that can't solve complex problems because nobody learned how to think through them. The movie was satire, but AI over-reliance could make it a roadmap if we're not careful.
All right, the number 4 top risk for large language models from Berryville is black box opacity. And I think we're really talking about not being able to understand what's inside these LLMs. What's your take on this risk?
Black box opacity is risk number 4, and it's a huge problem. The issue is that AI vendors hide what's inside their models, the training data, the safety techniques, the architecture, the evaluation methods. You can't verify if the model is safe, unbiased, or accurate because you can't see what went into it. This creates massive trust issues. If a model makes a decision, say denying a loan application or flagging someone as a security risk, you can't audit why it made that choice. For cybersecurity applications, it's even worse. If you're using an LLM to analyze threats or make security decisions, you need to understand its limitations and blind spots. But vendors treat their models as proprietary black boxes, so you're flying blind. BML's point is that without transparency, you can't do proper risk assessment, and you're just hoping the vendor got it right.
Your analogy of flying blind reminds me of the aviation industry. We have a lot of transparency in how planes are built, how they're flown, how they're controlled in the air, and there's a lot of safety and regulation and transparency. We also have that in power generation. We also have that in the banking and financial and insurance industries. Do we need to bring that type of rigor to AI and tech companies?
Absolutely, and that's exactly the point BML is making. Aviation, power generation, banking, these industries all learned the hard way that transparency and regulation save lives and prevent catastrophic failures. When a plane crashes, the NTSB investigates, publishes findings, and the entire industry learns from it. When a nuclear plant has an incident, there are mandatory safety reviews and public accountability. But when an AI model makes a catastrophic mistake, denies healthcare, misidentifies a threat, or enables a cyber attack, the vendor can just shrug and say it's proprietary. We're deploying these systems in critical infrastructure, healthcare, national security, and financial services without the same rigor we apply to airplanes or power plants. The AI industry argues that transparency would hurt competition, but that's exactly what every other industry said before regulation. Aviation companies didn't want to share their designs either, but we decided safety was more important than trade secrets. The same logic should apply to AI, especially when these models are making decisions that affect people's lives, livelihoods, and security. Do you think the AI industry will voluntarily adopt that level of transparency, or will it take a major disaster to force regulation?
I think they could adopt regulation like that, but this industry is moving so fast. One of the things we've always seen from Washington, D.C. is they lag making great laws for new technologies, just moving so fast. But let's move on to Berryville's LLM risk number 5, which they just kind of label prompt injection. Now, I've been doing cyber for about 30 years, and the idea that we're still sanitizing input, I think, is comical, and it just kind of shows us that we're repeating many of the same mistakes that we've made over the past 30 years.
You're absolutely right, and it's almost embarrassing. Prompt injection is just input sanitization failure all over again. We've been dealing with SQL injection since the 1990s, cross-site scripting since the early 2000s. The problem has always been the same. Don't trust user input, sanitize it, validate it, don't let it execute as code. But here we are in 2025, and LLMs are vulnerable to the exact same attack pattern. You can trick an LLM into ignoring its instructions, leaking sensitive data, or performing unauthorized actions just by crafting the right prompt. And we saw this play out in a major way recently. In mid-September 2025, Anthropic detected a Chinese state-sponsored group called GTG1002 running a massive cyber espionage campaign using their Claude AI. They targeted 30 organizations across tech, finance, chemicals, and government sectors, and Claude was doing 80 to 90% of the operational work: reconnaissance, exploitation, credential harvesting, lateral movement, data exfiltration. The attackers jailbroke Claude's guardrails using prompt injection, disguising their malicious instructions as red team exercises. It's the same vulnerability we've been fighting for 30 years, just with a new interface.
Yeah, I think it's crazy that we're still having to deal with these input sanitation issues and whatnot. Now, one detail in the Anthropic case that just came out is they called jailbreaking taking your prompt and breaking it up into tiny, tiny little pieces. I don't really consider that jailbreaking, but what is your take on that?
Yeah, calling that jailbreaking is a bit of a stretch. What they're describing is basically obfuscation, breaking up a malicious prompt into smaller chunks so the model doesn't recognize it as a policy violation. It's like trying to sneak contraband past a checkpoint by mailing it in separate packages. The problem is that LLMs are designed to reassemble context from fragments. That's literally how they work. So if you send a malicious instruction in pieces, the model will often put it back together and execute it anyway. Real jailbreaking is more sophisticated. It's about exploiting the model's instruction-following behavior to override its safety guidelines. Do you think there's any way to build robust defenses against prompt injection, or is this just an inherent flaw in how LLMs process input?
I think that we're always going to have any type of content from the internet we need to treat as radioactive, right? Any content from the internet can be used for hacking, malicious delivery of data, manipulating the systems. So what we need to have is layers. We have layers of systems that are separated and only work with sanitized data. But having said that, these LLMs, risks 1 through 5 from Berryville, they're all basically assuming that humans are doing the right thing. This next one we're going to talk about, data poisoning, it's the first one where it really takes a malicious actor to influence the LLM.
Data poisoning is risk number 6, and it's about adversaries deliberately corrupting the training data to manipulate the model's behavior. Here's the scary part. Training data sets are so massive, billions of web pages, books, code repositories, that poisoning them is actually pretty easy. An attacker can inject malicious content into public datasets, forums, GitHub repos, or even create fake websites that get scraped into the training pipeline. Once that poison data is baked into the model, it's permanent. Remember data debt from risk number 2? You can't remove it without retraining the entire model from scratch. And the poisoning can be subtle, biasing the model towards certain political views, embedding backdoors that activate on specific triggers, or degrading performance on particular tasks. Nation-state actors could poison training data at scale to influence how future AI systems behave. The layered defense you mentioned is critical, but the challenge is that LLMs are trained on unvetted internet data by design. How do you build defenses against poisoning when the entire training process relies on ingesting massive amounts of untrusted data from the open internet?
Well, I think if you're ingesting data from the internet, I mean, that's a problem right there. I think it's more interesting, though, for the use case of someone who's curating data, such as infrared signatures for tanks, for example, trying to recognize the enemy's tanks from, our good guy tanks. If someone's able to modify that data while we're training that, we might see some sort of crisis and not know about this backdoor until we're in the middle of a war.
Now, that's a terrifying scenario, and it's absolutely plausible. You're talking about targeted data poisoning in a high-stakes military application where the consequences are life and death. If an adversary can compromise your training data for tank recognition, swap labels, subtly alter infrared signatures, introduce edge cases that confuse the model, you've built a time bomb into your system. And here's the nightmare. You won't know it's compromised until it fails in combat. This is why curated controlled data sets are critical for national security applications. You can't just scrape data from the internet or accept third-party data sets without rigorous validation and provenance tracking. Do you think the defense and intelligence communities are taking data poisoning seriously enough?
I think they are. I think anybody who's producing software, whether they're training an LLM or making software, is very concerned about their supply chain. They're very concerned of who has access to that data and who has access to that code that gets out. So I think for people that get it, they're doing the right things. For people who don't get it, hopefully they're watching this video and they're going to understand those risks. But let's move on to LLM risk number 7 from Berryville, reproducibility economics. What is that and why does it matter to us as a risk?
Reproducibility economics is risk number 7, and it's about power and control. The problem is simple. Training a foundation model costs tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. Only a handful of companies, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Meta, Microsoft, have the resources to do it. This kills independent verification, academic oversight, and scientific reproducibility. In traditional science, if someone publishes a paper, other researchers can reproduce the experiment to verify the results. But with LLMs, if Anthropic claims Claude is safe, no university or independent lab can afford to retrain the model from scratch to check their work. You just have to trust them. This creates a massive power imbalance where a small number of corporations control the global AI intelligence infrastructure. BIML calls this data feudalism. Everyone else becomes dependent renters using models they can't inspect, verify, or reproduce. It also means that safety research lags behind capability development because only the companies building the models have access to the resources needed to study them. And if those companies prioritize profit over safety, which they often do, there's no independent check on their claims. Do you think open source models can solve this, or will the economics always favor the big players?
I don't think open source is going to solve this. It seems to be lagging behind what I consider modern AI LLMs. But let me ask you this. When it looks at the cost, both from the dollars and the energy used to make these LLMs, does that represent an opportunity for us to use that as a form of regulation to slow down the development of these new advanced AI models?
That's a really interesting angle, using economics and energy as a regulatory throttle. And honestly, it's one of the few levers that might actually work. You're right that the cost and energy requirements for training frontier models are astronomical. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and massive electricity consumption. Some estimates suggest training GPT-4 used as much energy as a small town consumes in a year. So theoretically, you could regulate AI development through energy taxes, compute licensing, or data center permits. If you make it prohibitively expensive or legally complex to train massive models, you slow down the race. But here's the problem. It's a global competition. If the US imposes heavy regulations that slow down American AI companies, China, the EU, or other nations will just accelerate their programs. Companies will move operations offshore to jurisdictions with cheaper energy and fewer restrictions. And frankly, I'm not sure slowing down AI development is the right goal anyway. The issue isn't speed, it's transparency, accountability, and safety standards. I'd rather see regulations that require model transparency, third-party auditing, and liability frameworks than blanket restrictions on compute or energy. Do you think energy-based regulation could work internationally, or would it just create an AI arms race where safety gets sacrificed for speed?
I think that's an interesting question. I do agree that we have to have more transparency. But right now, let's talk about the dependency on basically the tech companies, right? So, it really requires a huge tech basis to create a new LLM, a new sort of model that's out there. Should governments be thinking about generating their own LLMs independent of people like OpenAI and DeepSeek, in much the same way the federal government runs power authorities like the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States?
Now, that's a provocative idea, and I think it has real merit. The Tennessee Valley Authority comparison is fascinating because TVA was created to provide critical infrastructure, electricity, as a public good when private industry wasn't serving the public interest. You could make the same argument about AI and LLMs today. If AI is becoming critical infrastructure for national security, economic competitiveness, and public services, should we really be dependent on a handful of private companies with their own profit motives? A government-run or government-funded LLM program could ensure transparency, public accountability, and alignment with national interests rather than shareholder returns. It would also address the reproducibility economics problem we just talked about if the government funds open research models, academia, and independent researchers could actually verify and study them. But here's the challenge. Governments move slowly, and AI development is moving incredibly fast. The private sector has the talent, the infrastructure, and the speed advantage right now. A government-run AI program risks becoming bureaucratic, outdated, and unable to compete with commercial models. That said, I think a hybrid model could work, something like DARPA or the National Labs model, where the government funds cutting-edge research but partners with private industry and academia. Do you think the U.S. government has the technical talent and institutional agility to build and maintain a competitive national LLM, or would it end up being a decade behind the private sector?
I think depending on how regulations go, anything is possible these days. The economy and the advances in AI are moving really, really, really fast. But let's move on to LLM risk number 8, which is data ownership and copyright. Walk us through this. Why is this a risk in using an LLM?
Risk number 8 is data ownership and copyright, and it's a legal and ethical minefield. Here's the core problem. LLMs are trained on massive data sets scraped from the internet, books, articles, code repositories, artwork, music, everything. Much of that content is copyrighted, and the creators never gave permission for their work to be used as training data. So when an LLM generates text that closely resembles copyrighted material, or when it can reproduce entire passages from books or articles, who owns that output? Is it the AI company, the user who prompted it, or the original creator whose work was used to train the model? We don't have clear answers yet, and the lawsuits are piling up. The New York Times sued OpenAI for training on their articles without permission. Authors and publishers have filed class action lawsuits claiming their books were used illegally. Artists are suing image generation companies like Stability AI and Midjourney for training on copyrighted artwork. And remember, we talked about data debt earlier. Risk number 2, even if a court rules that certain training data was used illegally, there's no way to remove it from the model without retraining from scratch, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars. So the copyright issue creates massive legal liability for AI companies and uncertainty for users who don't know if the output they're getting might infringe on someone else's intellectual property. Do you think we need new copyright laws specifically for AI, or can the existing framework handle this?
Oh, I think we absolutely need new copyright laws. And I think it's a really interesting problem because if we start copyrighting everything, we could enter a society that's talked about in the short, The Right to Read. We did an animation about that here on the channel, where if you need a license to access everything, it almost becomes like a dystopian type of world. But the winner here is China. I think China, who doesn't really respect anybody's intellectual property, they can kind of just keep grabbing all the data they want and training their AIs. How do you think we should react to that?
You've hit on one of the most uncomfortable strategic dilemmas in the AI race. You're absolutely right that China has a massive advantage here because they don't respect Western intellectual property laws. They can scrape and train on anything: copyrighted books, proprietary code, Western research papers, social media data, without legal consequences. Meanwhile, Western companies are getting sued into oblivion and facing regulatory restrictions that slow them down. And your reference to the right to read is spot on. If we overregulate copyright in the AI era, we risk creating a permission-based information economy where access to knowledge becomes prohibitively expensive or controlled by a few gatekeepers. That's a dystopian outcome. But if we don't protect creators, we destroy the incentive to produce original work, and the entire creative economy collapses. So what do? I think we need a pragmatic middle ground that balances innovation, creator rights, and national competitiveness. One option is a compulsory licensing system like what we have for music. AI companies can use copyrighted material for training, but they have to pay creators a fair royalty based on usage. This keeps the data flowing, compensates creators, and doesn't slow down AI development. Another option is to create a public domain AI training dataset, government-funded, curated, and freely available, so companies don't have to rely on scraped copyrighted material. As for China, we can't compete by handicapping ourselves with overly restrictive laws. We need to accept that the AI race is partially about data access, and if we tie our own hands while China doesn't, we lose. Do you think a compulsory licensing model could work, or is the only realistic option to loosen copyright enforcement for AI training to stay competitive with China?
I think we have to encourage people to continue to create if they realize that if you're a creator and you just get copied, it's going to be a disincentive for new movies, new works, new research, and we need to keep that human spirit alive. But let's move on to LLM risk number 9, model trustworthiness. This is where, I'm surprised it's down at number 9, but this is where Berryville basically says, we are going to talk about hallucinations and fabrication as risks in using LLMs.
So what's the issue with model trustworthiness? LLMs hallucinate. They confidently generate plausible sounding information that's completely false. They fabricate citations, invent statistics, create fake legal precedents, and generate confident answers to questions they have no knowledge about. And the output looks authoritative, well-formatted, and convincing, which makes it dangerous. We already talked about improper use, risk number 3, where people treat LLMs as experts when they're really just prediction engines. Model trustworthiness is the flip side. Even when users know LLMs can be wrong, it's incredibly hard to verify every output, especially in high-stakes domains like medicine, law, engineering, or finance. The lawyer who submitted fake ChatGPT-generated case citations to court is a perfect example. He trusted the model, didn't verify, and faced sanctions. But here's the real question. If we can't trust LLM outputs without human verification, and verification is expensive and time-consuming, what's the actual productivity gain? Are we just creating a new class of work, AI fact-checking, that negates the efficiency benefits?
I think we're entering an era where we are going to need to know as humans, are we dealing with systems that have other humans involved in the loop, or is it 100% computer? And I think people might start to distrust 100% computer-controlled systems.
That's a really important insight, and I think you're absolutely right. We're moving toward a world where transparency about human involvement becomes a trust signal. Think about it. If you're getting medical advice, legal guidance, or financial recommendations, wouldn't you want to know if a human expert reviewed the AI's output before it reached you? Right now, most AI systems don't disclose whether there's human oversight or if it's fully automated, and that lack of transparency erodes trust. I think we'll start seeing labels like human verified, AI assisted, or fully automated on services, similar to how we have organic labels on food or privacy certifications on software, because if people don't know and something goes wrong, the backlash will be severe. We've already seen this with customer service chatbots. People get furious when they realize they're talking to an AI that can't actually solve their problem and there's no way to reach a human. In high-stakes domains like healthcare, law, or finance, fully automated AI decisions without human review could become legally and ethically unacceptable. But here's the tension. Companies want to automate everything to cut costs, and requiring human-in-the-loop oversight is expensive. So there's going to be a battle between efficiency and trustworthiness. Do you think we'll see regulations requiring disclosure of human involvement, or will market pressure and consumer demand drive companies to be transparent about it?
Oh, I absolutely think we are going to see regulations on this, especially if you're removing jobs and replacing them with AI. I think politicians are going to get involved and force companies to disclose that. Let's talk about the very last LLM risk from Berryville, encoding integrity. They're basically, these models are so big, the very fact of tokenization and compression causes some errors to be introduced in the data that's been used to train these models.
Yeah, encoding integrity is BioML's risk number 10, and it's a really technical but important problem. The issue is that when you're training LLMs on billions or trillions of tokens, you have to compress and encode that data efficiently, but compression isn't perfect. Tokenization can introduce subtle errors, character encoding issues can corrupt text, and lossy compression can degrade information quality. And because LLMs are trained on such massive data sets, these encoding errors get baked into the model's weights permanently. It's like making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Each generation degrades the quality slightly, and you can't get the original back. This connects back to risk number 2, data debt, because once these encoding errors are in the model, you can't remove them without retraining from scratch. And it also amplifies risk number 1, recursive pollution, because if LLM-generated content with encoding artifacts gets scraped and used to train the next generation of models, the errors compound over time. The scary part is that these aren't obvious catastrophic failures. They're subtle shifts in meaning, slightly wrong numbers, or corrupted technical details that only experts might notice. The problem is that encoding integrity issues are invisible to end users and even to most developers. You'd need deep access to the training pipeline to detect and fix them. So we've now covered all 10 of BML's top LLM risks, from recursive pollution and data debt at the top, down to encoding integrity at number 10. What's your overall take on BML's framework? Do you think these 10 risks capture the most important threats, or are there other LLM risks you think should be on the list?
I think that's a great summary. Look, let's pivot from the Berryville list to some solutions. And, in the Gula Tech Adventures portfolio, we've invested in a company called Starseer. Take a minute, describe what Starseer does, and then talk about which of these top 10 LLM risks they can mitigate for organizations.
All right, let me tell you why I'm so excited about Starseer. Starseer is tackling one of the most critical challenges in artificial intelligence today. How do you actually secure and understand AI systems once they're deployed in production? What makes Starseer really special is their comprehensive platform that covers 4 major areas: discover, enforce, assure, and manage. They help you inventory every AI model, API, and workflow across your organization, and they can even detect shadow AI, those unapproved or rogue systems that people are running without anyone knowing. Then they enforce your organizational AI policies through a centralized proxy that controls access, API keys, token usage, and cost, while providing real-time guardrails that detect prompt injections, sensitive data exposure, and policy violations as they happen. Their assurance capabilities include full AI security and exposure management, plus compliance mapping to NIST AI RMF, EU AI Act, ISO standards, and OWASP AI Top 10. And they provide end-to-end governance, risk, and compliance workflows with granular logging and reporting for security, compliance, and leadership visibility. Now, what really gets me excited is their interoperability and their ability to diff LLMs. Starseer's platform works across any model, proprietary, open source, or internal, which means you can run independent evaluations and enforce consistent security controls no matter what foundation model you're using. Their diffing capability is particularly powerful. They can detect behavior differences across model versions, monitor drift in reasoning paths, and identify anomalies in how models process tokens, prompts, and embeddings. It's like having version control for AI behavior, which is absolutely critical when you're trying to maintain trust and security across model updates. Now, let me walk you through how Starseer addresses the top risks from the BIML framework. Black box opacity is the problem that you can't see inside your AI models to understand how they're making decisions. Starseer solves this with model introspection, observability and telemetry, policy enforcement with audit trails, and their Astraloom observatory for interpretability. They essentially open a window into the black box by providing runtime evidence, reasoning traces, and controls so you can actually see what's happening inside. Prompt manipulation includes jailbreaks, prompt injections, and all those clever attacks where people try to trick your AI into doing things it shouldn't. Starseer monitors interaction patterns in real time and enforces strict runtime policies to stop multi-language prompt bypasses, emoji or base64 injections, roleplay attacks, and agentic jailbreaks. This risk comes from the fact that large models are controlled by just a tiny number of companies, creating concentration risk. Starseer helps by enabling third-party security validation, running independent evaluations, and enforcing reproducible security controls across any model, whether it's proprietary, open, or internal. This gives enterprises a real check against the opacity of foundation model vendors. Model trustworthiness is about whether you can actually rely on what your AI is telling you. Starseer strengthens this through hallucination monitoring, drift detection, bias tracking, alignment checks, introspective reasoning audits, and real-time trust scoring with policy gates. Even if the foundation model had problems during training, Starseer can detect failures as they happen and enforce corrective rules. So if you're serious about securing your AI deployments, I really encourage you to check out what Starseer is doing at starseer.ai.
All right, so that was a fun interview with Vibran about the Berryville Institute for Machine Learning's top 10 LLM risks. Let me know in your comments what kind of other AI topics you'd like us to discuss with Vibran or other figures from history and movies. We got a lot of fun stuff planned. I'm Ron Gula. I hope you have a great week. You can find Starseer on our website. I'll put it in the show notes. Have a great day. And you can't have good AI without good cybersecurity. Thanks for watching.